My name is Adrienne Arsht, and I'm the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to welcome you for this timely and important discussion, the NATO Perspective, Strengthening Resilience Within the Alliance. The important discussion is jointly hosted by the Transatlantic Security Initiative and the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative. As we come together today, we are acutely aware of the escalating geopolitical tensions we face, particularly in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These challenges remind us that security does not exist in isolation. It is intrinsically linked to the strength and resilience of our allies and society. Today, more than ever, it is critical that we maintain a united front among NATO allies, as emphasized in Article 3 of its foundational treaty. Article 3 underscores that our collective capacity to withstand major shocks goes beyond military might. It's about the fabric of our communities, our values, and our shared commitment to freedom and democracy. Resilience is the ability of individuals, societies, and systems to withstand, recover from, and adapt to shocks and disruptions, and is a theme that resonates deeply in our current climate. It is not solely about defending against conventional threats, but also about fostering societal resilience that engages governments and civilians alike. We must build systems that empower individuals and communities to contribute to our collective security, reinforcing the ties that bind us as allies. As we reflect on the importance of unity, let us remember that resilience is not just a concept, but a commitment to each other. During today's discussions, we will explore the current state of national resilience among NATO members and partner nations. We will address the unique challenges we confront, highlight innovative best practices, and share lessons learned. Our goal is to identify actionable steps that will cultivate a stronger, more cohesive transatlantic society, ready to face the uncertainties of the future. I am particularly excited about the insights we will gain from our distinguished speakers today. We are honored to welcome Ambassador Michael Carpenter, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council, Ambassador Christian Prek, Ambassador of Estonia to the United States, and I think on video, Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Conversations such as this are integral to the mission of the Scowcroft Center, which seeks to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies for addressing the most pressing security challenges facing the United States and its allies. As part of the Scowcroft Center, the Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative works to advance resilience as a core tenet of U.S. and allied national security policy and practice. And the Transatlantic Security Initiative shapes and influences the debate on the greatest security challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance and its key partners. Thank you for joining us here and on video. And I would like to introduce a video message from Mr. Angus Lapsley, Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning at NATO. That will be followed by the panel discussion.
Hello. First of all, I'm really sorry I can't be with you in Washington for this event, but a really big thank you to the Transatlantic Initiative of the Atlantic Council for organising this seminar. We talk a lot about how in NATO we are resetting ourselves for an era where we have to think very seriously about collective defence, how we deter attacks on the alliance, and how, if necessary, we defeat them. We spend a lot of time talking about what that means for our militaries, for investment and reform of collective defence. But there's an aspect of this which I think we don't spend quite enough time talking about, and that is the broader resilience that would underpin how we do collective defence in our alliance. The way I think about this is that we would be facing two exceptional sets of circumstances if we were on the road to crisis and conflict. The first is we would be asking our militaries to do a whole range of things at a scale that we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. They would be moving forces, supplies, equipment across the European continent, across the North Atlantic, at a scale we haven't seen for many, many years. They would be needing to use civilian infrastructure like railway networks, road networks, airspace, ports, hospitals, food supplies, all sorts of things like that. And the planning that needs to go into underpinning all of those exceptional things is a real challenge and something that we need to rediscover the art of doing. We knew how to do it in the Cold War. We haven't done it for a very long time. So that's the first set of exceptional things that we need to be prepared for. And it's a planning challenge as much for civilian authorities as it is for military authorities. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that a second set of exceptional things would be happening in these circumstances. And that is that our adversaries, and in particular Russia, if that's who our adversary was, would be doing a whole bunch of exceptional things to try and make all of that as difficult as possible. Cyber attacks, disruption of space-based services, possible sabotage, disinformation, all sorts of things would be done to us to try and make it as difficult as possible to make sure that we were in a position to defend ourselves. So what we need to do as the military, but also as civilian authorities, is to come together and think about how do you deal with those two challenges at the same time. And that's why at the Washington Summit back in July, our leaders took the decision that actually all allies would put in place measures to ensure that we can do civilian and military planning together for national resilience and for the enablement of our military forces in a collective defense scenario. Now, all of this requires technical work. It requires serious people to sit in serious rooms and do the planning. But I think it also requires something else, and this is why I'm really pleased about the theme of the event that you've got on today, and that is it requires a broader dialogue with our populations, with our people, and with civil society. It starts, for example, with a dialogue with businesses. The Logistics Committee of NATO recently sat down, for example, with the chief executive of Deutsche Bahn Cargo to talk about how we would use Germany's railway network in the event of a crisis. But I think it goes beyond companies. It goes to actually talking to citizens and explaining to them some of the things that they would need to be thinking about and ready for. And that's why I think it's great that allies, like in particular Sweden, Finland, and some others, are now really deepening the dialogue that they are having with their populations about thinking through what preparation for conflict means. Ultimately, NATO is a defensive alliance, and we're an alliance which is based on deterrence. Our aim is to make sure we never have to do these things. But the best way to make sure we never have to do these things is to make sure we've thought about them and prepared for them. And we can paint a convincing picture to any adversary that actually there is no point testing us, there is no point provoking us, because we'd be ready. We'd be ready from a military perspective. We'd also be ready from a broader societal readiness perspective. So once again, I'm really sorry I can't be with you there today, but this is such a great set of issues to talk about. I'm really pleased that you're giving them some more profile, and we at NATO stand absolutely ready to work with you as we take these issues forward. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, thank you to everyone for coming this morning in the United States, and to everyone watching from Europe, good afternoon. My name is Laura Kelly. I am the foreign policy reporter at The Hill, and I'm honored to moderate today's discussion. Thank you to Ms. Adrienne Arsh for your remarks and for welcoming us here, and Assistant Secretary General Angus Lapsley. I am pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists. We are fortunate to be joined in person by Ambassador Michael Carpenter, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council. Thank you. And we also have Ambassador Christian Prick from Estonia. Thank you for joining us today. And virtually from the United Kingdom is Elizabeth Braw. Hi, Elizabeth. Senior Fellow with the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalization, The Return of a Divided World. And also thank you to our in-person audience. I sometimes like to ask a question to the audience before we begin. How many people here are from a NATO member country? If you could raise your hands. Okay, and how many people are from a NATO aspirant country? Yeah, Georgia. Okay, later in this conversation, we will turn to audience questions. All questions can be submitted via askac.org. That's askac.org. Now, I was going to wait until maybe the third question to talk about President-elect Trump, but I was inspired by Ms. Arsh's remarks about societal resilience. And Ambassador Carpenter, if I could start with you, what did you learn about how Americans view America's place in the world given the election of President Trump?
Well, as we think about resilience, it's easy to focus on the vulnerabilities, the threats, and the things that have gone wrong. It's harder to understand all the gears that are in motion behind the scenes that prevent risks from escalating into real threats to our national security. And the election is actually a great example of this. Despite all the vulnerabilities that we face and all of the various adversaries who would like to interfere in our election and in our process, we had an election in November that was pulled off without any major disruptions, without any major foreign adversary able to put sort of sand in the gears of our electoral process. And that's a huge accomplishment. And it's one of, frankly, hundreds, if not thousands of examples of major events with national security implications where our team at the NSC is working behind the scenes to ensure that we provide that resilience, that we guard against those threats, but it's not visible necessarily to the outside public. And so that's comment number one. Comment number two, which is, I'm not talking here, I don't really do politics, I do geopolitics. So I'm not going to get into our domestic political landscape. But what I will say is that, for me at least, the way I look at it, the chief driver of vulnerability in our societies is political polarization. That is the one thing that gives our adversaries an advantage in being able to use our own networks, whether it's cyber networks, information networks, financial networks, to turn those around and use them against us. Dark money, cyber attacks, misinformation, disinformation. So that is, I think, the chief task before us as we head into a presidential election transition, is how do we prevent political polarization from making us much less resilient and more vulnerable than we would otherwise be.
And more in your sphere of work, it was Russian election interference in Moldova, Georgia, Romania, a NATO country, now having to redo its presidential elections. Behind the scenes work, was it enough? I mean, how have Russian advances or foreign adversary advances outpaced democratic defenses?
So Romania is a great example of the vulnerabilities that we face in democratic societies. This is an astounding story that I think a lot of folks are going to be digging into over the course of the next weeks and months and studying exactly how this came to pass. And at this moment, today, we don't have all the facts in front of us. What we do know is that a far-right candidate who espoused admiration for Romania's interwar fascist leaders, was able to go from polling in the single digits to winning the plurality of votes in the first round of a presidential election, which then the Constitutional Court found invalid, or the Central Election Commission. It is an astounding jump in polling based apparently, from what we know today, on a TikTok campaign that was financed by unknown actors, probably a foreign state adversary. Speculation is that it's Russia. At this point, the United States, we don't have the evidence of that, but we also can't exclude that that is the likely actor behind this dramatic electoral result. And so it's just one example of many where sophisticated foreign adversaries using techniques, tactics, and procedures that we have not necessarily seen before. We've not seen anything quite like this. We had interference in our election in 2016. There's tomes produced by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence that detail everything that happened there. But this was brand new, and it's something that can happen, I think, in other countries. And it goes precisely to resilience. And how do we have better literacy in our population? How do we guard against some of this abuse of social media? How do we deal with, especially as we enter an age where AI is going to play a bigger and bigger role in everything that we do? How do we guard against algorithms influencing our lives and undermining our resilience and our democracies? And that's something that we're going to really have to focus on in the coming years, because this is happening now at an accelerating pace, where AI is enabling all sorts of both good things, but also malign actors carrying out these sorts of operations, for lack of a better word.
And I do want to get to our other panelists, but if I may just follow up, Ambassador, have you been in touch with anyone from the Trump team so far about these kind of threats?
So we are waiting for the transition process to get underway. I'm sure once it does, I understand the paperwork, at least for my agency, for the National Security Council, has been signed. There's a range of issues that we're eager and excited to brief the new team on, because it's very important that we do have an orderly handover of power in this country. And there are a range of threats out there that we've been focused on, and that we want to make sure that the new team is also aware of and focused on, so that they can tackle them literally from minute one that they're in the office.
Yeah, and I mean, how long would you want to speak with them for? Because now it's only a couple weeks until they take office and you haven't spoken to them.
In my area, which is Europe, there is a whole list of things that we need to cover. These vulnerabilities are extensive, and the geopolitics now are changing so quickly. I mean, just look at what happened in Syria over the course of the last 2 weeks. It's really exceptionally dramatic. So there's a lot to talk about, and we hope we can roll up our sleeves and do that, have those conversations as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for indulging me. And Elizabeth, also, if you want to jump in and comment at any time, feel free to just, grab my attention. Ambassador Prick, Estonia is on the front line of foreign sabotage campaigns, allegedly by Russia, maybe some of its allies. Cutting off communication lines in the seas, damaging energy lines, GPS jamming of flights, sabotage at the border, cyber attacks, just to name a few. One strategy NATO has employed is to increase intelligence sharing and naming and shaming when these activities happen, but not really announcing any plans for a response, or not acknowledging when member states may respond. How long can a strategy like this go on for before more public action needs to be taken?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the whole event today. So I think NATO and the individual NATO countries, we constantly have to adjust and make sure that whatever we do is relevant to that challenge of the moment. In fact, I would say that the way we've decided to not only share more intelligence, but actually step up our game with naming and shaming, as you said, but also actually convicting people that have carried out some of these sabotage acts, as you mentioned. I do think that this has already raised the deterrence level, and has already sent the message to at least some of these people that maybe hired to carry out that kind of campaigns or individual acts. But it's quite clear that the allies among themselves, but also individual allies are constantly trying to think of new ways how to manage or avoid that kind of hybrid warfare acts being kind of carried out. Now, whether what we've done thus far is sufficient, or whether the level of deterrence in that domain is sufficient, probably the answer is not yet. But unfortunately, when it comes to resilience, it's not an end state that can be declared, and then we can also declare that we have reached this end state. It's a constant process to maintain and increase the level of the resilience, and this also entails informing the public and making sure that it's not just the government that are in this game, but also that the private sector and different other organizations play their part and also understand the kind of risks that we are talking about. I believe that in Estonia we've actually gone quite a long way in making sure that the government is better aware of the vulnerabilities that are there when it comes to private sector owned infrastructure, for example, but also that the private sector really understands what may be coming at their way, so to say, or what kind of threats, what kind of actors may be out there. I was in the position of coordinating some of these Estonian efforts like 10 years ago, and I do remember the instances where the private sector really wasn't aware of some of the existing threats even back then. But then again, we also had several instances where the government, including the military, wasn't aware of the dependencies that we had on the private sector and the needs to defend or protect some key pieces of the infrastructure that actually were vital to keeping some of the processes running in the country.
If I may just follow up, Starlink has been kind of a game changer in communication systems in the Arctic. How concerned are you about the control that Elon Musk has over whether to take that away at any moment?
I think whether it's Starlink or some other system, the diffused architecture of key pieces of infrastructure to not be dependent on just let's say one power station, not be dependent on just one communication node, or for not being dependent on one let's say organization or one company providing a particular service is the key for future. So I wouldn't talk about one individual versus another, but I think it's important that we really don't put our eggs into only one basket, and that we make sure that if option A fails, then we have option B, because the adversaries may always be after the option A.
Ambassador Carpenter, maybe you have insight. Elizabeth, maybe you have insight. Is there any competition for Starlink?
I mean, there are all kinds of communication systems there in an everyday use. To my knowledge, there is no let's say second Starlink with the same kind of architecture of satellites per se. But then again, there are also alternative or other ways of communication that countries are using every day. So, yeah.
I'd just say when it comes to resilient communications, there is an over-reliance on space-based assets, satellite communications in general. And so whether you're talking about the Arctic or you're talking about maritime communication or just generally, GPS systems, all of that, very reliant on access to satellites. So as we think about building resilience, this is one area where we need to focus on having multiple different types of communication systems that could operate in a crisis environment.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your patience. Very interested for your thoughts on some of the things we've talked about, but just to focus in on a comment that Ambassador Prick said about deterrence has not yet been achieved with some of these hybrid warfare tactics. How do you view it, and what more needs to be done? Oh, do we have audio? Maybe, are you?
It's a pleasure to see you. That's what I was going to say. And then I was going to say that resilience is part of deterrence, and specifically it's part of deterrence by denial. And deterrence is, the way it functions is that it's in the eye of the beholder. So does the other side, at what point does the other side conclude that or decide that the cost outweighs the benefits? And this is what we are in the difficult position of having to guess, because we can't ask the Russians or anybody else at what point they are feeling deterred by the prospective punishment, but also the prospective cost of trying to attack us, and us then providing resilience that makes it a lot harder for them to achieve the harm they are trying to achieve. And this is the dilemma with all forms of deterrence. You have to ask the other side. You wouldn't have to ask the other side at what point they're feeling deterred, but the whole reason you have to deter them is that you're not exactly on very collegial terms. So that means that we are never going to be able to say or conclude that we have achieved resilience. Also, it's extremely hard to define resilience, and even if I didn't have to ask the Russians, I would struggle, for example, to say is such and such company resilient. It depends on what it is you want that company to achieve under a state of duress and what that state of duress is. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the objective we need to achieve is for our societies to keep going even under duress, whether that be from climate change or harm caused by hostile states and their proxies, which, by the way, is a fast spreading form of grey zone aggression, the use of proxies and various freelancers all the way down to criminal gangs. And so the best we can do is, first of all, to inform the public about the threats that do exist and that keep proliferating in new and numerous ways, and then tell people what it is, what the basics of resilience are. And I've heard for so many years now, I've heard it argued that it's only the Nordic and Baltic countries that are suitable for this because they have a history of societal resilience. No, it's not just the Nordic and Baltic countries. I started becoming interested in societal resilience when living in San Francisco for many years, and the city council ran a public awareness campaign about earthquake preparedness, and it was so effective that I still have it memorized in my head, and I've been prepared for earthquakes ever since. And by the way, it's the same sort of preparedness you need for other emergencies as well. So having water at home, knowing how to reach your loved ones, and by the way, also having canned goods at home, blankets and so forth, knowing how to reach your loved ones when disaster strikes, because you're not going to be able to use the mobile network. You will overload it, and that will harm those who really need to use it. And you also should not expect that the government will come to your aid, because the government has to focus on those who need its help most, whether it be the local government, the state government, or the federal government, depending on the structure of the country in which you live. And it's really important to demonstrate that we know what to do in a crisis, because as with all resilience, the more you demonstrate that you'll be able to deflect the harm, the less attractive the harm becomes. So that's why it's so important that resilience is, that some countries are beginning to strengthen resilience. And it's not just the usual suspects in the Nordic and Baltic countries. It's for example, a country like the Czech Republic, which now has, which launched a few years ago, gray zone exercises with private companies so that they know what to do when gray zone attacks of whatever kind they may be hit the country. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, Laura, but the point is the resilience is not a defined term. It is in the eye of the beholder. We can only guess at what point the Russians and other countries wishing to harm us decide that we are so resilient that it's not worth their while trying to attack us. But at the very least, we should get the basics in place. And the good thing is that this is happening. And it's not just happening at the initiative of governments. Private companies are doing a great deal because they have also concluded that they are vulnerable, and they started working on resilience plans and alternative supply chains away from single sourcing. They started doing that years ago, and it's slow going, but it's happening. And this is part of why it's so great to live in a liberal democracy where individual actors, whether they be companies or ordinary people, can make those decisions for themselves because it's in their interest to keep our society going.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to pull out something you said about how in an emergency, civilians shouldn't expect to count on the government to be there for them. And I just wonder if you two, as government representatives, can mull that over for a little bit. But Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, what did you learn about the US presidential election with the election of President Trump, who and the resilience of American society as part of the collective of NATO, when we have opinions that want to withdraw from the world, that don't view support for Ukraine as burden sharing, but view it as an expense, view NATO as a burden. What do you think needs to change for the mindset of Americans to be able to be more resilient in terms of what is the benefit of engaging with the world, and especially in NATO?
Well, the 2016 election was a clear reminder to everybody that hostile countries will try every means at their disposal to harm our countries. And there were significant efforts at election interference by the Russians. And I have to say, the aftermath was frightening because opinion polls or surveys showed that a majority of Americans thought that the Russians had been successful in interfering with the US elections. Frankly, we don't know how successful the Russians were, but what matters is that a majority of Americans thought they were successful. Well, if a majority of citizens in any country think that another country has skewed the outcome of the election, what does that do to that country? It instills the idea that the outcome of the election is not legitimate. And that is a really frightening thing in a liberal democracy where our social contract depends on us giving our votes and then trusting that first of all, the elections are conducted correctly, and then that those elected by us handle that power we have given to them with care and responsibility. But I think what's uplifting about recent American elections is that election interference hasn't been as successful, and that Americans, fewer Americans believe now that, indeed in this most recent election, that the Russians or others for that matter were successful in interfering. And so it doesn't really matter what the outcome is. What matters is that people's faith in the system exists, and that most people trust that America's elections are done correctly, and that whatever the result is what people intended the result to be, so that America doesn't end up in a situation like Romania, as Ambassador Carpenter just mentioned, where you cannot be sure what happened, and if what appears to have been the outcome of the election was indeed what people voted for in that election.
Okay. Thank you. Did you guys want to comment on whether civil society can rely on their governments?
Sure. I'd like to actually give a shout out to some of the countries in the Baltic Nordic region who have embraced a total defense concept where they really invest in society at large, not just civil society, autonomous groups within their societies, but really the public at large, teaching them how to be prepared for different scenarios and different types of crises and understand the threat landscape as well. One of the examples I like to give when it comes to Russian disinformation is the fact that Russia shut down a lot of the local language versions of Sputnik and RT in places. I don't know if they did that in your country, in Estonia. I think they did. In Finland, for sure they did. Why? Because the populations in these countries were just not tuning in. So they didn't have the audience share that they needed to make this a sustainable enterprise. And so they had to shut down their disinformation efforts. That is a result of decades of citizens understanding the nature of Russian propaganda and disinformation, such that it became ineffective. But it takes education. It takes a society-wide effort to be able to get citizens to be prepared and understand what they're facing in order to deny a potential adversary or a real adversary an advantage in that type of situation. But I mean, this comes up periodically. By the same token, even as I give the shout out to Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, which was consistently rated by Transparency International as one of the most transparent societies on earth, had one of the biggest sort of financial manipulation crises in the history of the world with Danske Bank as a result of Russian financial malign influence. So you only are as resilient as you are if you're not being stressed and tested by adversaries. So the system has to be continuously put through sort of a process of being stress tested, and citizens and institutions and organizations and private companies that operate in that society have to understand what the risks are so that they can adapt. I think Denmark has proven very resilient and has come back from that scandal with Danske Bank, but it just shows that we may be focused on one threat and then we could see another one coming out of left field that we're not as prepared for, and that could ultimately be the one that does damage to our society.
Ambassador Prick, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, on the resilience and the messages to the general public, I think I would absolutely support Elizabeth's argument about the resilience being, let's say, source agnostic, or whether it's natural disaster, whether it's man-made disaster or actual military conflict. Some of the kind of key principles are the same. Crisis, after all, is by definition a situation where business as usual is not possible. And the message that we have given to our people, our companies also, is that let's make no mistake, we are making constant efforts to build this resilience and in the let's say military sphere, build the deterrence and make sure that no one really develops stupid ideas. Let's put it that way. But there may be situations where the government and also private sector has to ruthlessly prioritize the services that can be maintained and the particular activities that get more attention, and some of the services may have to be dropped because of the major national disaster or a situation related to actual war. So for that reason, we are also giving our citizens advice on how to prepare for that kind of situation. So there is even a nationally available app called Be Ready or Be Prepared that gives advice on what kind of food products people should have, what kind of I don't know, batteries and other things. Every family should have at any point available. The general principle is that the family should be able to sustain at least 7 days with the most basic, food products, water, and some other things. But certainly the message is not that the government won't be available or the government doesn't care, but it's about prioritizing, and it's about survival and again restoring all the services as quick as possible.
Yes, yes, and we all have autonomy to make sure that we're taken care of in the event of a crisis. Looking at NATO and defense spending also as a pillar of resilience, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is preparing NATO allies that defense spending must increase to between 2.5% to 3%. Estonia is one of 5 countries that spends more than 3%. Ambassador Prük, how realistic is it that other allies can increase their defense spending to these levels, and what would be a good time frame?
I certainly cannot speak for other countries and for their political decision makers, but I think it's well known that most of the countries have taken a, let's say, fresh look into the not just the spending side, but also the but it all has to start from the fair and honest assessment of the security environment and the kind of threat picture that we are facing, and also the kind of capabilities and organizations needed to take care of these threats. And I think the clear trend line is going up in terms of understanding the size of the challenge and the kind of resources needed for that. Yes, Estonia has been advocating for going above the 2% level. We've publicly said that we think the 2.5% level is more appropriate. But then again, I think usually NATO reaches major agreements on issues that have so wide, that affect countries so widely. During the NATO summits, the next summit will be end of June in The Hague. So this might be the place where this issue will be certainly discussed and probably or maybe adjusted the current agreed levels.
Thank you.
Laura, if I can just add.
Yes.
There is a real risk, I think, in only focusing on defense spending, and it's such a totemic number, 2% or not 2.5%. But frankly, if we have well-equipped armed forces, but then nothing behind them, then that expense is almost worthless. We have to have the resilience behind those armed forces as well, and that's why resilience matters so much. It doesn't just matter in its own right. It matters as the complement to the armed forces, which is why Sweden and Finland were so focused on total defense during the Cold War, because they knew they had to utilize every resource at their disposal. And part of that resource are the armed forces and the men, as it was then, men who serve in the armed forces. But then you've got to utilize everything else, and that's the rest of us in our private lives, but also in our professional lives. And if we keep focusing on 2.5% or even 3%, and then forget about resilience, the Russians are going to conclude that, attacking civil society using gray zone or hybrid aggression, that is exactly the way to go, because our countries are not resilient. And that's why this matters so much, and it's not just a luxury concern, but one that matters for signaling and also for capability when these acts of aggression strike.
Yes, and Secretary General Rutte said at an event the other day that even if you increase spending by 4%, it doesn't mean anything if it's not done in a smart way. And I'm sure he tried to make those arguments to President-elect Trump when they had dinner in Mar-a-Lago. Ambassador Carpenter, before we head to audience questions, I want to ask you, the Biden administration has put Ukraine on an irreversible path to NATO. But there's no telling how long that path is. Will there be any change in language before President Biden leaves office on an invitation for Ukraine into NATO?
So I think this is a very important question that we've been discussing a lot internally. I think it's at this point going to be up to the new team to decide how to leverage Ukraine's eventual NATO membership in the course of the next few months as they contemplate, a negotiation, possibly happening in 2025. I'm not convinced that we'll get there or that it'll conclude in 2025, but potentially beginning in 2025, they will need to figure out how to make this work. Right now, we don't have 32 allies that are agreed, where there's consensus within the alliance to offer the invitation. We have an agreement that at some point Ukraine will be in NATO. For me, there is no way to give Ukraine the security guarantee that it needs to have to function and thrive as a sovereign, democratic, independent state without the Article 5 guarantee that NATO membership provides. So the sooner we can get there, from my perspective, the better. But it's a matter of political will, and it's a matter of political unity. You need to have all 32 allied parliaments ratify the membership in order for Article 5 to be operational. So the invitation is just one of many steps. There's like 7 or 8 that we've gamed out that need to happen between now, where we are today, and that eventual Article 5 security guarantee that Ukraine will enjoy and then be able to prosper and thrive. At this point, we've got just over a month left in this administration. It's going to be up to the new team to decide how to work this. But I do think it's essential. We have thought long and hard about interim security guarantees, what sorts of things we would like to see Ukraine have before it gets the Article 5 collective security guarantee. And we could talk about that. That's another conversation. But ultimately, it needs that in order to survive.
Did you want to add something, Ambassador?
I absolutely do agree with Ambassador Carpenter on the centrality of the NATO security guarantee. And I would just like to add that we all, I think there is a broad agreement on the need of security guarantees to Ukraine as part of the whatever end negotiations will be there. There should be an understanding that there will be security guarantees for Ukraine, because after all, this is not only about the future and security of Ukraine, but also the future and security of European security. That there won't be a next war that is of the same magnitude or potentially even wider war. Now there are those who then insist that for some reason NATO membership is not doable, and some kind of other security guarantees should be weighed or considered as an option. And we are very much on the same page that when it comes to realistic and sustainable peace for Ukraine, but for Europe and for the world, the most both effective as well as cost-effective security guarantee there is the NATO membership. Actually, I haven't heard any design or any vision of alternatives that would be politically realistic, militarily doable, and economically anywhere close to as efficient as the NATO membership is.
So, Ambassador Carpenter, I mean, how regretful or how heartbroken are you that Ukraine and NATO wasn't achieved during the Biden administration?
Well, I think it was always going to be very difficult to get a country that is engaged in the biggest land war since World War II to enter the alliance while it's fighting. I think under any administration, that is a proposition that would be just very difficult to envision how that could possibly happen, where you have, now we have 32 allies with Finland and Sweden, before 30, agreeing to admit a member where they would immediately have to come to the defense of that member with their own, not just with their own capabilities and equipment, but with their own forces. So that was never going to be under any administration of any political party, not just in the United States, but in all of our allied publics as well, or political systems. That was never going to be an easy proposition. So what we have focused on is preparing Ukraine, and that's why at the NATO summit that took place in July here in Washington, we rolled out a series of deliverables that will prepare Ukraine such that when the invitation comes, it'll be ready to sort of plug and play with the alliance on day one. They'll have all the NATO interoperability already built into their armed forces. They will have the capabilities, and the alliance will be prepared through this NATO Security Assistance Training Ukraine program, which is a brand new mission that we stood up in July, prepared to support Ukraine and build out its future force. We've done all that preparatory work. Now it's really a matter of, well, it will continue for the coming months, but now it's going to be a matter of political will. But to get there, and this is, again, to the heart of your question, there has to be a cessation of hostilities. It is difficult for me to envision, maybe someone in the audience or online can challenge this. It's very difficult for me to envision a scenario where allied publics and parliaments and politicians would be ready to make that step while there's a hot war.
So pushes towards a ceasefire in the second Trump administration, but since you haven't met with any of the Trump officials, you can't make your argument to them about how.
Well, pushes for a ceasefire. I hesitated earlier when you asked the previous question about a negotiation in 2025, because a negotiation in and of itself is not going to get us anywhere. To have a negotiation that leads to a cessation of hostilities, you have to leverage the negotiation. We have been trying to put Ukraine in a position of strength. We have been facing an adversary in the form of Russia that has far greater strategic depth and far more forces and a much larger society to draw those forces from. That has been the fundamental challenge. This has been a math equation. There have not been enough Ukrainian troops on the front lines relative to the number of Russian forces. So we have been doing everything we can with giving them capabilities, air defense systems, anti-personnel landmines even, all kinds of capabilities to put them in the best possible position. But they're going to need more. And so as we think about a negotiation, everybody's talking about this is going to happen in the next administration. The question is, where's the leverage? And that's the question for the new team, and it's for our allies, it's for everybody that supports Ukraine. Where is the leverage? How are you going to leverage a negotiation that actually leads to a sustainable solution?
Yes, well, we've seen the new team talk about exercising leverage over Ukraine to bring them to the negotiation table.
That is not the solution. I mean, it's important that Ukraine be willing to talk when the time is right, but you have to focus on the other side of the equation. How are you going to get Russia to the table where they are ready to talk about something other than the capitulation of Ukraine?
Yes, well, it would have been helpful if maybe we had a Trump representative on this panel. I think we have time for one question. I'll take it from Stavros Piperidis from Johns Hopkins SAIS. He says, the NATO Public Diplomacy Division has opened the call for applications for project grants on societal resilience. What do you think are some key areas or priorities of academia and think tanks should work on to enhance our NATO societal resilience?
Actually, I would kind of throw in one topic that has not been addressed today, but that will be certainly an issue that we all have to deal with in the coming years and decades probably. The cross-border resilience and the dependencies that we all have to be aware of and have to be ready to work in order to avoid those vulnerabilities becoming really crucial. What I'm referring here, I'm referring to the situations where for example, we can imagine a situation where there is a US company owned data center in one allied country that actually is crucial to the operation of government in some other country, and maybe even the operation of the military of this other country. But this is a very crude example and generic example of dependencies. But there are more and more of these cross-border vulnerabilities or cross-border dependencies internationally that we need to be aware of, and we need to really think through how to make sure that when the crisis hits the alliance or parts of the alliance, that we are aware of these dependencies, and we have strategies and tactics ready how to make sure that these vulnerabilities don't end up hurting us really, really bad.
And how would you
Can I just add, Laura?
Oh yes, go ahead, Elizabeth.
It's actually linked to what Ambassador Prick just said, and that is the importance of command and control. If we need command and control in resilience, just as we have in the armed forces, because without that, resilience just becomes an individual effort by some people and by some companies. And if there's no coordination and no command chain or chain of command, then first of all, it's not effective or as effective as it could be. And second of all, the government is in no position to coordinate it and to use it to the benefit of the whole country. And we don't want islands of prepperdom. We do want a comprehensive effort where everybody knows, or many people and companies know what to do, and where it's all coordinated so that it functions according to national priorities, and so that we then can also signal appropriately to the other side that look what we can do. They don't need to know the details, but we are prepared, and that is absolutely indispensable.
Okay, thank you so much. And we are at time. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation with me. Thank you all for coming and watching online. I found it very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.